Hey everybody, welcome back to another episode of Indie Game Movement, the podcast that talks about the marketing and business of indie games. I'm Andrew Pappas, I'm going to be your host today, and this is episode 256, where we're going to be talking about understanding how your price can affect player behavior. Now, we have discussed numerous times on the show that understanding player behavior and your audience is so important when it comes to marketing your game. But one thing we don't think about as much is how people react when money is involved. Understanding how price can change how people can act can be a very daunting challenge, but knowing a little bit more of how it plays in someone's decision to purchase your game can make a huge difference. So that's what we're going to be talking about right here today on Indie Game Movement. Hey everybody, and we're back, and I just want to say today it's gonna be me. Just me, and to be completely honest with you, a lot of that has to do with just the way things have been recently, just a lot really busy, lots of vacations going on, and scheduling is always a challenge and such, as you can imagine this time of the year for those of us that are in the middle of summer or kind of approaching the end, I guess. So, but yeah, that's the format that we're going to have today. But don't worry, we still plan on having lots of future guests that we're really looking forward to and hope that you are as well. But just for today, for the sake of how things are going right now, in light of everybody's schedule and such, it's going to be me today in this format. So I hope you're still on board and excited on that front. I know I am, because I'm really excited about this topic, because I just think it's a really interesting way to look at something, involving your pricing and how that really affects people, right? So outside of that, not too much else is going on with me, as I mentioned. Vacations, being busy with a lot of different projects, all exciting stuff. And as far as what I'm playing, I am still playing Final Fantasy 1. I am just very grateful that the internet exists for if of everything else, obviously, that's out there, that's what the internet is helpful for. Final Fantasy, the first one, is definitely one of them. I just had no clue how many bugged spells would be in this game. And it's saving a lot of hard-earned gil by reading up what not to do in the game on the internet. So that's all I'm going to say on that front. So I won't spare you any other details on that. Still having fun. But yeah, it's a challenge in its own right. So, all right, cool. So again, the topic for today is understanding how your price can affect player behavior. And again, I just want to kind of approach this from the perspective of getting into your player's mind. I mean, as you know, on the show, we're really big into not just having empathy, but doing what we can to get inside your player's head, because ultimately they're the decision makers, and knowing how certain things affect their decision on things is really, really important. I mean, at the end of the day, that's really what we're trying to figure out in whatever means we can. So that's why I thought it would be really interesting to look at something that typically doesn't involve the players, but being mindful of them throughout this process. Now, quick thing I wanted to mention here too. This is by no means an extreme guide to pricing your game. There's lots of information out there on how to do that. We're going to get into some of those topics as they apply, as I mentioned, to getting into your player's head, but there are still a lot of other things that you should consider. So I don't want you to come here thinking this is going to give you every single thing that you need for a pricing perspective. We are simply just looking at this from the lens of how it affects players. So without further ado, I'm going to kick this off with, not necessarily relating to the player behavior, but more so when it comes to pricing your game. The first question I want to ask you is, are you ready to sell your game? So I think this is an important one, though, and it's somewhat relative, because while you may feel like you're ready and really ready to sell your game, I know some of you are, there's still a lot of things to consider. And the first one I'm going to kick off with is, what is your goal for your game, right? This is really important to think about. And just about anything that we've talked about before with what you're doing with your marketing, with your business, is think about your goals and keeping those in mind. But in particular, when you're selling your game, what is the goal for that? Now, obviously, at face value, yeah, you want to make money. You want to sell your game and make money. That's obviously an important one. But it's always good to think a little bit beyond that. So, like a few other things, like, are you trying to build up your portfolio? Are the sales of this game going to help support your next project? Like, those are all the things that you need to consider. And part of the reason why I'm positioning things in that way is because depending on how the sales of your game go, those are other important things to consider too, because especially if you're launching your first game, I mean, I'm looking at things from statistics here. There could be a good chance that it's not extremely sustainable or whatever. It doesn't say it's not going to make anything or anything like that. But it's the first project isn't necessarily going to be the one that keeps you, having a new lifestyle and quitting your day job and stuff. It could, but it might not. So other things to keep you in mind as you keep going on this journey of what are those goals that you have? What else can this do if this isn't the one that's going to make it for you or get you to the next level? So really thinking about what your goals are for this game. Obviously, your main one is to make your money, make it back and everything. But what are the other goals too? Because it's really important to consider those things. Just because there are no such things as overnight successes. Everything kind of gets portrayed that way. It really takes a lot of failures before you get to that step. And I'm not saying that everyone out there is going to fail when they're making their first game. Obviously, we know that's not the truth, but it's also not the reality in terms of everyone out there is going to make a hit right away, right? So I just being pragmatic and really thinking of and getting yourself in that mindset, more specifically of determining what the goal is for your game and thinking of what those other goals are too is really important. Another thing to consider as you're getting ready to sell your game, or if you're ready, is does your game provide a great experience? Now, this is definitely more player-oriented because, like, everything that you're doing up until this point is really to provide an awesome player experience, right? And the really asking yourself, like, have you done everything possible to provide the best experience? It's really important to consider that. And I know to an extent, like, you may have exhausted all resources or funding or things like that, and you just can't do anymore. But really, like, have you gone through, checked off all the boxes, make sure, yes, it's really up to that point? Is there anything else you can do and things like that? And I'm not trying to have you go crazy and prolong something that you've been wanting to do for a while or whatever, but really just making sure that you're doing that, because even as hard it is to market great games, if your game isn't great, it's that much more challenging to really get to be able to sell your game and make the most out of it. So that's one thing to definitely consider. And again, this also applies, and everything we're really talking about here is also kind of to an extent applying to games that are going into early access, right? So it's a little bit of a different path. I'm not going to go too much into it. That could be a whole nother episode in itself, obviously. But thinking about that, because early access, I think where people get cut off is, it's early access. It doesn't have to be finished, right? But to really make an early access game successful, there's a few key components, and one of it is just making sure you're still providing that overall best, great experience for people. Yes, it's a work in progress. Yes, people are under they have that understanding. But if it's like super buggy and stuff, it's not going to be helpful. The other important thing to consider and remember is that early access is essentially treated like a game launch anyways. Steam doesn't, for example, if you're doing this on Steam, which I'm assuming most of you are, Steam doesn't differentiate between the two. If you're launching in early access or launching your game, it's all the same to Steam. So that's good to consider. And then another thing too, when you're going in early access, make sure you have your updates planned out. Those are super important to really showcase the progress and stuff. So just quick little tip on that too. Another question to ask yourself if you're ready is, could your game use more marketing? Now, this doesn't probably come up to mind with people in general, especially if they're getting to the point they're like, all right, let's launch the game. We're ready. We got it done. But could it use more marketing? Could the extra time, could a prolonged launch date help you get more wish lists or followers? Or what else could you do? Like if there's all these extra resources or now let's say you have more time on your hands and you could be marketing more, is that going to pay off if you prolong the date? So it's really good to look at things that perspective too, right? Because you don't necessarily want to say, hey, we're here. We said we had this deadline and stuff. And if there's no real reason to launch at that specific time, then really think about what else could be done so I could further benefit how this game is going to perform when we launch it. So that's another important thing to consider as well. And then, does your game provide a great experience? I already said that one. I'm going down my checklist here and realize I copied and pasted a couple of times, but that's okay. It happens. We all make mistakes. No, but last but not least on this subject is what else is going on? So, okay, you're ready. You have all these, you checked off all these items, but being aware of what else is going on, right? So what other titles are coming out? Is there an upcoming sale you could take advantage of? Like, are there other events that could help or even limit your game's exposure when it gets launched? Like, all different things to consider. And last but not least, and of course, do you have a marketing plan or a campaign planned out for the launch of the game? Just simply hitting release or launch or whatever, and then going with that isn't necessarily going to be a good thing unless you have some other means to help promote that, right? So make sure you have a plan in place too, and just be aware of what else is going on. Okay, let's move on into really the key aspect here and the key focus of this conversation, which is, how does your price affect players? So when you're determining your price, first and foremost, it's completely up to you in terms of what you decide on this front, right? But there's a lot of things to consider. Like I said, we're only going to be covering a few of these in terms of like the player's perspective. Now, one thing it's good to come up and keep in mind is what kind of players are buying the game, right? So you should already have a good, clear sense of who your core audience is and everything else like that. But one thing to consider is when you're thinking about the players that are buying this is, do you already have a dedicated community ready to buy? And now the reason why I'm asking this question is simply, whatever you're determining or thinking about deciding for your game, would they buy your game based on what price you set? So let's say if you're going between like $15 or $20, is that $5 difference going to make a huge difference for your like dedicated fan base, the people that love your game are ready for what it is and what they've seen and everything else? And I think it's important to put yourself in that scenario and think about it, because I would say in most cases, if you have a really dedicated community and just super excited about the launch of the game, chances are that $5 price difference isn't going to make or break them in terms of like, are they going to buy your game or not? Chances are they're going to buy your game anyways. So it's a really good exercise, I think, to consider, because sometimes what people will do is they're afraid that, if my game is priced too high, then people won't get it, or they'll complain about it, or X number of reasons, right? So then they end up going too low. Now, obviously, and this is why it's good, because if you can think of that at a certain value or price point, your dedicated core base is still going to pay for it and still find the value in that, then that can kind of help set the precedence in terms of, okay, one main good reason why you should set the price maybe a little bit higher, because you know that they're going to be paying for that, and you know that they're going to be happy with it anyways. Now, keep in mind, there's always going to be someone who doesn't like your price, and if they're not complaining about it, well, that's not necessarily a good thing either, because you should always have someone who's complaining about your price to an extent, and because you can never make anybody happy. So going into with that idea and mindset too is important as well. But again, I think it's always important to kind of put yourself through that exercise, seeing what would your most dedicated fans be willing to pay. What do you think? And then we have other factors to discuss too and to consider, because obviously if they're willing to pay $60, that's awesome, but no one else is going to pay that. We know that, right? Like, unless you really feel you can compete with the AAA there, but I don't think anybody should go with that strategy. And if you do, please let me know. I would love to have you as a guest on the show. But yeah, so just really think about that and that kind of perspective. I think it can help sort things out in terms of with everything else. Now, another thing too, I'm thinking more of a general sense of like, how will your game's price be interpreted by players? And I'm not just talking about I'm talking about prospective players, not necessarily your dedicated community or hardcore fan base. Now, a couple of things to consider. So whatever your pricing is, like have you considered what the perceived value is, right? So perceived value, that's one of those things that's kind of interesting, because like what does that mean? And basically it's, let's say if I set something for $1, right? Simple, easy. Hey, everybody has a buck they can throw out. But what does $1 get you these days, especially with games? Okay, I'm sure any number of you right now are thinking of either lots of different mobile games out there, not to devalue the games on the mobile market for only $1, but especially when sometimes there was you could see Switch games for as low as $1 or whatever, right? But when you know that the average price of a game is not $1, you kind of start questioning, okay, what is really the value of this game if it's $1? Now, obviously, I don't think anybody on Steam, for example, is going to price their game for $1. Of course, there's other factors too, like the market, and we'll get into some of that in a moment. But really just considering what is the perceived value and going a little bit further into that. Like, how are players feeling about a low price versus a high price? So I gave an example with the low price, but let's say if you're pricing a game, and I'm going to be a little stereotypical here, that it's clearly indie, a game that's clearly indie, which is, let's say, pixel art, retro looking, anything along those lines, whatever you would define as an indie pixel game, right? But let's say you price that at like $40, $50. Now, what's the perceived value there? It could be really high, but it could be very, priced out of market, for example. But let's say at face value, people will say, well, that's off. It doesn't align with what I think as a consumer. So it's really important just to kind of like go both ways and see how does that play. So making sure that their production value aligns with the price too. So whether it's like 2D or 3D or all those other different factors are going to kind of play into the pricing in terms of how players are going to look at that and feel what is, justified and everything else. So, again, really thinking about the low end and the high end and stuff is really important, and how that game's perceived value is interpreted by those players. Now, another question is, how much value are players getting with your game? So one thing I want to say, because I think a lot of people get caught up in this area, is it's not about the experience, but it's about like how many hours they're playing, right? I would say the opposite. I think it's all about the experience and not necessarily about the hours. Now, hours are an important thing to consider too, and I think a lot of us are really familiar with seeing like reviews and people saying, "Oh, it was a good game, but I beat it in like an hour or whatever," right? Or sometimes the expectations are very unrealistic. They're like, "Oh, I beat it in 20 hours," and yeah, and I mean, wow, like for me, 20 hours sounds like that's a pretty robust game based off of, how much time and energy I have to play games. So those are the types of things to consider. But again, this is why I'm asked earlier, is your game ready and does it provide the best experience possible? Because that's going to be more the selling point, I think, than anything else, at least as a key factor, right? Just my thoughts about it. Now, hours are still important. For example, like, considering is there replay value and what's that replay value like? That's definitely important too, because getting a little bit more hours on there from that perspective and people wanting to replay it again is definitely a good thing. But what I'm trying to say too is your pricing shouldn't necessarily be dictated based off of how long or short the game is. It should be more based off of the experience and the value that experience provides. So when you're really thinking about, pricing too, just think about that overall value. How important is that experience for those players? What type of experience are you providing? And try to determine what that, how that price can, sit around that aspect of the game. So another thing, obviously, to consider is how do players compare you to the market? Now, this is super important, and I'm sure something we're all familiar with is just making sure you are familiar with the market and what the price range is, and making sure that you're pricing something within reason. And another thing too is consider knowing, is the market saturated or is the game that you're making in high demand? Those are all other factors to consider, but I wouldn't necessarily go into whatever market you're in, if it's saturated or not. I wouldn't necessarily go I've heard this terminology before called race to the bottom. Let's say the standard price here is like $15. I'm gonna do $9. Just so that way you can outprice all these other people. Because again, that question, and even though it's a much smaller window here, that question goes into effect, which is, what is the perceived value of this game? If I know as a player that the market is, the average is about $15-$20, and you're pricing your game at $9, and I have a few other people in my wish list, who am I going to consider over you if that's where the decision lies, right? And so that's where it's important. So that's, again, why perceived value is really important, because in a situation like that, you might want to go a little higher, especially if you know you're providing a really awesome experience and value there. And last but not least in this area is not necessarily affecting the price for the players, but more so of, what are the time and resources that you put into the game? So it's really important because, if you're tracking your hours and everything else and what your costs are, you basically, at the end of launching the game, want to recoup your costs. So in order to do that, you're going to have to do some projections. And as you start doing your projections, you want to make sure that your price is going to not just reflect the market, but also the perceived value and all those other things. But you want to make sure that your pricing is done in a manner which can get you back to, not just covering your costs, but doing more than that. So when you're doing projections on that front, you want to make sure that you're really covering all that and being aware of those things, because that's really important too. So for example, if let's say you're pricing your game versus $10 or $20, right? Well, $20 is going to get you a lot faster back to covering your costs and making more than $10. You're going to have to do twice as much work. and that's what I'm trying that's kind of what I'm looking at it from that perspective, is really considering how that pricing is really going to affect how you reach your goal in that case. Another thing too, just like a quick tip here, is when you're doing your projections or anything like that, you want to be mindful of localized pricing. And for those of you who are familiar, basically all that is certain countries and markets have localized pricing where it can be as much as half of the cost of what you're already pricing. So, for example, if you're pricing a $10 game and it's being sold in China for $5, that's going to go against your, especially if part of your strategy or your core audience is based in China. That can really throw off your numbers too. So again, something to be mindful of too when you're doing projections is being mindful of just the localized pricing that's there. I believe Steam has documentation on their site that showcases and lists out all the localized pricing and how pricing can differ for different countries, things like that. So just another thing to be mindful of when you're doing your projections on that front. All right, so talked about initial pricing and stuff, and I know I'm not necessarily giving you specific numbers. I'll kind of wrap up things at the end in terms of what I think would be an ideal pricing, but again, it's really up to you. It's case by case and everything else. So, but before we go into that, another important area I'd love to discuss more, and I'm sure a lot of you are thinking about it too, is should you discount your game? And I'm going to give you my answer of what I think at the end of this. But some other points to consider. Again, it's really up to you what you want to do in terms of discounting, what the strategy is behind it. But here are some things I think are important, especially when you're thinking about how players are acting towards pricing, right? So, again, how does the perceived value for players change when you discount? So if you set your price, let's say $20 for your game, and at some point in time, whether it's already it's been on sale for a while, or you just launched, you set it at 50% off. So now that $20 game becomes $10 game. Wow, that is such a dramatic price difference from 20 to 10. So just in that scenario, what are people now thinking about your game? I don't think anybody would ever price their game in they may have, I don't know, but actually have done what I provided as an example. But I mean, still, it does a lot right there, and that perceived value. What do you think that does for someone who looks at your game for the first time? Steam's boosting it a little bit because you launched and everything. You got that little initial boost, and they're seeing a game that's should be $20, but they're getting it for $10. Yes, they're probably thinking, "Oh, I'm getting a great deal, great." But at the same time, they're looking at that. Look at other games that are in maybe the $10 price point and how it compares to yours, and other games that are $20. So if players are doing that same type of reasoning, they might feel that, okay, I got a good deal and I don't care as much now about this. So what's happening now is they're thinking this game isn't as important as it should be if it were $20. Yes, the original set price was $20, but because it had such a huge, significant discount, they might be thinking less of it. And you don't necessarily want, I would say, there's a lot of other reasons for it, but you don't necessarily want people to think less of your game just because the price changed alone, right? So that's definitely something to consider, is like, how much is that discount? And a good, as I phrased it before, a good question to ask is like, do players feel that they're getting a deal, or now do they feel that the game could have lesser value? And another thing to think of from that perspective too is just consider when depending on how much you're discounting is how significant discounts, they also require a significant amount of volume to make up for that difference. So with anything that's like 50% off or whatever, you're making up your now in order to hit those projections and everything else, unless you already made projections with these this discount strategy and involved, you're doing twice as much work to get that same like revenue number. So the way I like to look at it is try not to do more work for less, because that's essentially what you'd be doing in a way. To an extent, that's what you can be doing with some of your discounts if they're not necessarily thought out that well in being strategic. So think of ways where you're not doing more work for less and such. So, and another thing to consider too is when you're doing discounts, what type of signals are you sending to players? Because, for example, and I think I provided this in the previous example too, is if you discount too much too soon, like from when you release, it can really hurt you, as I mentioned before, but it can hurt your players because from your players, from the perceived value, but you, because if you already set the expectation like, hey, look, we're willing to go as low as 50% off, then people are going to hold out for that. You set the precedence. You let them know that, hey, I'm willing to go this low. And if you do that, then it could be a real uphill battle to try to initiate some type of strategy to really get those people. Because even if you do it like 30% or 20% later, and those are good discounted numbers there as well. If they already know that that's as low as you can go, it's definitely going to be a challenge. So again, it's definitely worth considering what are the signals that you're sending to people. Now on the flip side, like if you, let's say on launch, like go as low as like 10% or 15%, I think that's in an appropriate threshold area where people are still getting a deal. They know that off launch they're probably going to get a deal anyways, and they can take advantage of that. And then later you can determine, if you haven't already, what's going to be the right, discounting strategy for you going forward. And as you go on with the launch of your game and everything, it's also good to consider the shelf life of that, and then how much of a discount makes sense at certain periods of time. So if you start off with like 10%, and then in 6 months or to a year or whatever the case may be, you can start determining what is going to be an appropriate one. So then that way, like, thinking more long-term and stuff, because again, even if you're not selling as many units as you would like, if you're still making a good amount of sales from the regular price game and getting and then reducing it, you still have to do double the amount of work, double if it's 50% off, but you're still doing potentially more work depending on how much more you discount. Now, if it's a game that's been on the market for a while, then it might make more sense to do 50% off, because people have known, like, okay, that game's been out like a year, 2 years, whatever, extended period of time. Then it makes more sense to probably discount there. So another thing I think is important too is when you're considering discounts and other things, think about your audience and your community. So one way to pose this is, how can you and others create more value for your audience? So one way to do this is pair up with like other devs and have special events or sales. This is something that I believe as a group of developers can approach, or whether it's an individual or a group, can as long as you have a group with other people, can approach Steam to have sales. I think I'm trying to remember. I think it was Chris Zukowski a while ago mentioned this as an idea before too, and it's another. And a lot of times when you have those grouped together, you could have it like they like stack if you have like sale prices going on and such too. So it's one way. You're providing more value for people because you're giving them an opportunity. Like, they probably already like the style of game. You're pairing up with other devs that have that same style or genre of game, and now you're giving them an opportunity to have a whole list of games that they really like, and it gets you that much more in front of like a really good core audience. So by doing that and collaborating with others, you really are providing more value for your audience, and those types of things can work out extremely well. So something to consider there, and it's like making your own opportunities there too. Not necessarily just relying on a Steam sale where everybody is going to be waiting for that. So it gives you a little bit more exposure there. And then another thing to do on that same front is you can create bundles with other devs too. So again, creating discounts. So let's say it could be one strategy where you're not discounting that much, but you're going in with the plan of creating bundles with other devs, and maybe you can offer significant discounts with those bundles. So as a group, you can make this bundle super appealing and everything. But it could potentially be like disguised in the sense where people don't see what they're actually getting from the discounted price. I mean, they could probably figure it out and stuff, but no one's going to go through all that extra work. So again, that's a great way where maybe you can discount a little bit more heavily, but without it necessarily just, being seen as if they're just going right to your page and seeing what that discount amount is. So that could be another way in terms of like providing another opportunity for people to get your game, get it with others at a good price, and giving you a little bit more control on that front. So the final question here, as I said I would answer, is should you discount your game? And here's my take on it. There's really no right or wrong answer. People have used discounts before that have worked really well. People have stood their ground and haven't really discounted much at all, and done well on that front too. But if it were me, and what I would encourage other people to do is to try to maintain a standard level of pricing with little to no discounting. Now, this, of course, is a case-by-case basis. This really depends on a lot of other factors, like what type of game it is. Is it free to play? What's your pricing model in general? Like, there's so many other things to consider. But if you're in this situation, and something like this model makes sense to you, I mean, like, that's just how I think it should be. Because what it comes down to is you're maintaining that level of integrity that players can respect. And that's important, because the way I look at it is simply from this perspective. You're making games, and you're really committed to doing this beyond just one game. And if you continue going forward with that, you're going to set the expectations of your player base that, you really care and believe in not just your pricing, but you're putting out a quality product. And I'm sure that this would also carry over with everything else that you're doing, from marketing to how your brand is being represented, like all these other things that we've talked about on the show. That's why I think, from my perspective, and again, I'm just doing this from me. Have I made a game or launched a game, and could this idea change dramatically when or if I do that? Yes, it definitely could. But I still think that mindset is a good one to have, to let the pricing be a factor in terms of maintaining a standard level of quality that you will continue to carry on as long as you're making games. So that's my perspective of it, and that's what I would encourage you to try to do, is just maintain that level of pricing without going too hefty on your discounting. Now, again, there's a lot of other factors at play, a lot of other variables. There's like so many different things to probably consider in that too. And that I'm not even going to begin to go into the different scenarios, because there's a lot of them. But that's how I would try to approach it. It's not to say that's the way to do it. That's what I would try to lead with, though. So I hope that makes sense there. So with all that, I hope you found this helpful in terms of how to approach this topic in terms of pricing from a different way to kind of get inside your player's head and what does pricing really mean to them and how does and how does it play into you? I mean, ultimately, it's your decision. I wouldn't ever let like a player dictate what my pricing should be for your game. Face value. Like, don't ask them and because I'm also a firm believer in let people vote with their wallets to a degree, opposed to what they feel that they would pay for, because that can always change. So these are just ways that I would go about approaching things and trying to be mindful of what it's like from a player's perspective when they're considering purchasing a game. What are the potential things that are going through their head, and really putting yourself in their shoes, because again, I think that can be really helpful in having a better understanding of where they're coming from, whether they're happy with the pricing or not. It's okay. It just gets you a little bit more prepared for that. So to kind of summarize everything we talked about here, before you get ready to sell, make sure you're ready to sell. And as we mentioned, like, do things align with your goals? And are you providing the best experience possible? And do you need more time with your marketing? Those are all really important things to consider before you start selling your game, because it's going to make a difference to the players as well if you're really well equipped and prepared on those fronts. Really important one here is consider the perceived value. We talked about that a lot. Really understanding what are you showing to people based off of your price, not just the original set price that you're creating, but also what that price is after it's discounted. And in line with that, know what signals you're sending to people. If you're heavily discounting your game right off the bat, or even not too much further down the road, what kind of signals are you sending to people? Because if you're sending the wrong ones, they're just gonna you're setting those expectations to be in a position where you don't necessarily want to be, unless of course a specific strategy or your product type kind of like dictates that. But in most cases, you probably don't want to go too low, because again, it won't be sending the right signals to the people that you want to achieve the goals that you're looking for when you're selling your game. So I really appreciate all of you for joining me again and listening to this topic. And if you're interested, I would really love to continue this conversation on Twitter. So whenever you're listening to this, whether it's the day of this episode launched or you're catching up, love to continue this conversation on Twitter. It's just at IGM Podcast. Just tweet anytime you'd like. I think it could be a really good one. And so again, thank you so much for listening, and looking forward to having you join us next time on Indie Game Movement. Hey everyone, thank you for listening to another episode of Indie Game Movement. I'm Andrew Pappas, your host, and the show's producer is Mustafa Price. If you enjoy and value the show's content, you can support us even more by going to Patreon and visiting www.patreon.com/IGM podcast and select the tier that best suits your needs. Show notes for this episode can be found by visiting rengenmarketing.com, the number episode of the show. Rengen Marketing is a consulting marketing company that helps indie devs with their marketing efforts. Whether you need guidance with your game's marketing strategy or could use a free marketing plan template, then please visit www.rengenmarketing.com and take action. A special thanks to Dakota Saw for Season 2's opening theme and Melissa Gellis for the new logo design. And as always, thanks for being such great listeners, and we'll see you next time on Indie Game Movement.